Hello, everyone. My name is Eric C.K. Fortner, and today I want to share my experience visiting a spiritual service as part of our MHW 640 course. For my visitation, I chose to watch an online sermon titled Embrace the End Times by Pastor Gregg Locke. I selected this specific sermon partly out of curiosity and partly for its provocative title. I know that I've heard of him. I know Pastor Locke is known for his passionate and oftentimes controversial preaching style, and I wanted to definitely engage with a perspective different from my own. I was interested in, observing how a faith leader addresses themes of stress, hope, and community, and how a service might relate to preventative care and wellness. People do turn to these guys for those things. But what I experienced was pretty eye-opening. There was some inspiration, yes, but there was a lot of concerns. And in this presentation, I'll reflect on my personal reactions to the sermon, explore how this kind of spiritual class or service might contribute to overall wellness, discuss its potential use and interventions, and explain why, with definitely some caveats, we might encourage similar faith-based approaches to support client stress relief, self-esteem, relationships, and spirituality. Watching Pastor Locke's sermon was a journey through mixed emotions. First, I noticed a strong undercurrent of political preaching in his message, frequently intertwining scriptural references from the Bible with political commentary, even to the point of urging social and political stances. This definitely struck me as hypocritical. It felt as though a religious platform was being used to push partisan agenda, while simultaneously denouncing others for politicizing the faith. As someone who values the integrity of spiritual teachings, I definitely found myself unsettled by that approach. In fact, I recognized in myself a form of spiritual dissonance. There's a disconnect between the inclusive, compassionate ideals that I associate with God and with Jesus, and the us versus them rhetoric that I was hearing from this guy. Research shows that such negative, conflict-laden religious experiences, what scholars sometimes call like religious struggles or existential crisis, that can actually heighten distress and depressive symptoms. So I could feel that truth during the sermon. The combative tone raised my anxiety rather than alleviating it. What I saw, to put it simply, this pastor was exploiting his flock's existential dread in order to influence their political decisions. I also observed what I felt was a misuse of Scripture a lot. Bible verses were quoted, but completely out of context, seemingly just to validate this guy's points about current events or whatever his agenda was, which was obviously the end of times narrative. This made me realize how easily spiritual texts can be cherry-picked to justify almost anything. Mental health counselors should be mindful. Clients may come with deeply held beliefs that could be shaped by potentially skewed misinterpretations. And this part of the experience reinforced the importance of biblical literacy and discernment, understanding the context of spiritual teachings. This way, to avoid internal conflicts or guilt that can arise from distorted spiritual or religious messages. There were a couple of parts of the sermon that did resonate with me pretty deeply. There was one moment where Pastor Locke led a prayer, an emotional prayer for those struggling with addiction. He invited his congregants to pray over people that were dealing with addiction and spoke about giving money to something called the Brook House, which I looked up and is a great organization. But again, no record of Pastor Locke having ever given any money to them or having any kind of connection to them at all. So I don't know if this was hollow or not, but that was a part that resonated with me. There was another part that had resonated with me as well. He talked about dealing with the pressures in life and things like that. And he talked about meeting a California firefighter that was doing a controlled burn. And he said that he asked the guy, well, why are you burning this, And he said the man told him that fire don't burn where fire done been. And I know that story was completely made up, but I do like that idea of facing life and facing your demons directly and letting that fire burn you so that the larger fire of life can't consume you. Throughout the sermon, I couldn't ignore the overt Christian nationalist political messaging that was present. The pastor's words always blended like a right-wing definition of patriotism in with piety, implying that the devotion to this interpretation of the Bible or faith was always tied to a specific national identity or political stance. And that's isolating to anybody who doesn't want to go along with that. That's where the groupthink is going to begin, and people are going to begin to just follow that message for fear of what happens after they die, basically. For people that are already on that political persuasion, for some, it might create a strong sense of identity and purpose. But for others, those who don't believe in those things and might have different ideas about the world, it could create stress, guilt, or isolationism. Indeed, balancing faith and worldview is delicate. But, supportive spiritual teachings can foster peace and well-being, while this extremist and polarizing messages might contribute to the stress and trauma and definitely to the national divide. There was one point in there where he was reading a passage out of Matthew, and it was the part where Jesus is describing the future fall of Jerusalem. And he read this passage and he says, yeah, it says this and this, but we don't have time for that now. We have to talk about Elon Musk and Donald Trump and all of these things. And it was just pretty disturbing. Now, for preventative care and wellness implications of this, despite my mixed reactions, the experience did underscore how participation in spiritual services can be a form of preventative care for many people. Preventative care in wellness isn't just about doctor visits or exercise or going to yoga or all that. That's important too, but it's also about nurturing the mind and spirit. I think a big problem that we have that is not talked about is a collective existential dread permeating throughout at least American culture, or in the Western world for sure. There's a considerable evidence that being part of a faith community like this, it's linked to positive health and mental health outcomes. For example, Balboni et al. 2022 found that active spiritual community participation like this, such as attending religious services regularly, is associated with healthier and longer lives, including lower rates of depression, suicide, substance use. In other words, simply showing up and being involved in a supportive religious group can build emotional resilience. And, I reflected on that during the sermon when I saw people in the congregation clapping and cheering, and some even cried. It was clear that those people found a sense of belonging and they shared a purpose there. They were listening to this man. There's also research from Sutherland Institute report. It's a Sutherland Institute report, likewise indicates that the social aspect of religious practice, like interacting with others in a worship or a service like this, it's crucial for the mental health benefits of faith, more so than just private belief alone. So we're individuals, we're people that crave other people and need other people. And so by regularly engaging in such communal events and activities, people are going to have reduced stress through hope and through prayer. Those things are powerful. They're going to feel less lonely because of all the people there, all the fellowship, right? And maintain a more positive outlook grounded in a sense of spiritual purpose. It helps alleviate some of that existential dread when you feel like you're doing the same thing as everybody else and those people have got it right. And so it's it gives you a sense of purpose. And all of these factors, they act as protective buffers, potentially preventing the onset of more severe mental health issues by addressing basic human needs for connection, for meaning, and for hope. But my visit my visit, but watching this thing, it also highlighted caution, because preventative spiritual care must be healthy spiritual care. This was not healthy. This was preaching a lot of division and judgment of others. It was really the opposite of what Jesus's actual message to the people was. And it was very divisive. It reinforced my belief for spirituality to aid wellness. It should promote empathy and humility and support, rather than what this was promoting was fear and anger. And, when those conditions aren't met, spiritual services or classes, they can be very damaging. So using the experiences in intervention, I've reflected on how this experience in spiritual engagements in general could be utilized in clinical or wellness interventions. As a counselor, I would need to recognize that integrating a client's spirituality is vital in part of their treatment. So if you get somebody who is a member of this Pastor Locke's flock, and they have deeply tied spiritual beliefs through these teachings, and their sense of existential dread is alleviated because of this, if we create cognitive dissonance within that person about their faith before we can deal with whatever else the problem is, it's going to spiral into a major existential crisis. And research supports this idea that incorporating spirituality into treatment can improve outcomes. So in one review, McCullough found that religion accommodative counseling was more effective than standard secular therapy for treating depression, and similarly just all mental health ailments. If somebody has wherever they are in their faith, they must be met there and have that at least become a foundational reaffirmment so that they can build upon that. So, another way that I would think that I might use this experience if I were a mental health counselor is by being more attuned to the content that my clients consume. That would be important to know that this person who might be attending this Gregg Locke's sermons is going to have a certain worldview locked in place, that it's basically landmines. If we're trying to avoid unnecessary cognitive dissonance, then we're going to want to avoid those things as they want addressed. And mental health providers should be trained in this stuff to discuss and integrate those issues during care. In the mental health field, we often talk about treating the whole person, and which would include obviously their body and their mind, and as well as their spirit. And after watching Embrace the End Times, I can see several reasons why we might encourage clients to consider healthy spiritual practices as part of their self-care regimen, provided it aligns with their beliefs and comfort levels. So it's for stress relief, engaging in prayer, worship, or meditation can induce calm and reduce anxiety. Many people find that releasing their worries to a higher power or finding solace in spiritual music and readings can help them unwind and gain perspective. During Pastor Locke's sermon, for instance, I saw individuals close their eyes and lift their hands during prayer, and it was definitely a very positive experience that the audience was having. And it also will affect a person's self-esteem and their identity. So a positive, affirming religious community can help individuals develop a stronger sense of self-worth. And many spiritual teachings emphasize that each person is valuable and loved, made in the image of God, right? And that's what Jesus taught. Unfortunately, Gregg Locke's teaching was not teaching that. It was kind of teaching the opposite of a lot of that. And this message, when a positive message, if it's conveyed in a healthy way, though, it can counteract negative self-talk and help clients build self-esteem. So when I was watching that, I noted that even though some of the sermon's tone was harsh and triggering and obviously there to influence the political actions of the crowd rather than provide spiritual guidance. And that's what I had a problem with as far as that goes. But, for clients who struggle with self-esteem, feeling anchored in something bigger and knowing that they have inherent worth in their faith can be very empowering. So we might encourage such a client to engage in supportive faith-based affirmations. It's just tough because you don't want to go after if they're fully indoctrinated into this cult-like thing. It's just you have to be very cautious when attacking that. As soon as your client feels defensive from you, then it's over. You're not going to be able to reconnect with them. And anyway, for faith-based support like this, it's going to help with relationships and social support, obviously, because they're going to have a congregation of people in there with them, being loving to them and positive to them and accepting. And one of the greatest benefits of spiritual involvement is the community that it builds. Loneliness and social isolation are a huge risk factor for mental and physical illness. And participation in these communities directly addresses that by offering, like I said, friendship and mentorship and a sense of family where they may not have that. And at the sermon, when I was watching this, even though I'm watching this as a complete outsider, I didn't know anything about this guy, and I don't agree with what he's doing as far as it. In my opinion, he's literally using the Lord's name in vain. He's using God's name to advance a personal agenda, and that's what that is. But again, these things aside, spirituality and meaning, like at the core of this whole thing, is the spiritual well-being itself. And people in general and our clients, they're going to seek a sense of meaning, purpose, and connection to something greater than themselves. And spiritual approaches provide a framework to explore those existential questions, whether it's through, theological answers. Why am I here? What is my purpose? Is there a divine purpose? Or through practices like mindfulness and meditation, because there's a lot of religious practices that emphasize mindfulness and meditation, a lot of Buddhist teachings. Just engaging spirituality can fill the void that pure material, or as I like to call it, 3D, or just clinical approaches are going to miss. So, for example, hearing Pastor Locke speak about the, quote, end times, obviously it didn't align with my personal beliefs, but clearly this gave his listeners a narrative that made sense of world events and their role in it. And that's what was important. It gave them meaning and purpose. And humans naturally try to make meaning of chaos. A spiritual worldview can offer that meaning and comfort and in uncertainty. God has a plan. And as therapists, if we encourage clients to explore their spiritual side, we're basically helping them tap into a profound source of hope and resilience. So, in studies in positive psychology often note that hope and meaning making at least, are associated with better coping and even improved overall health outcomes, physical and mental health. So, again, by supporting a client's spiritual beliefs and exploration, we're supporting their overall quest for well-being and for finding meaning and answers to these existential questions that plague all of us, because the unknown is oftentimes completely unbearable. So in conclusion, watching Embrace the End Times was pretty challenging, but it was also in some ways enlightening. I engaged with a spiritual environment that showed me two sides of faith's impact on wellness. One side, I saw how a strong community and a heartfelt prayer can uplift people, even if it's misleading them. It fosters hope and purpose and support that are invaluable for mental health. On the other side, I also witnessed how extremism and misuse of spiritual authority might harm well-being and cause conflict or stress. In the very least, make it easy to incorporate potentially dangerous governmental situations like fascism if they make it part of God's plan and make the suffering part of being pious. Then the people are not going to, the people will be more willing to accept what may be happening. And so that critical reflection has deepened my understanding that spiritual wellness isn't a one-size-fits-all easy fix. When approached in a healthy, inclusive way, it can be a powerful component of preventative care and a useful tool in interventions. This particular one, I felt like while it is doing those things for their client's mental health, it's also leading them down a road to destruction. And it's also making sure that they miss the entire point. Because when this pastor reads a quote from the Bible that's out of context, doesn't even explain the gospel or any of that, and just says, here's what the Bible says, and here's what it means, people are not going to go and look for a second opinion or try to read it themselves or any of that. They're just going to listen to this person who's
Why is it you pull up to a church that says they operate in faith and you have 50 handicap parking spots? Ain't nobody laid hands on them handicapped folks yet. I don't care what Twitter says. You can get mad all you want to. Fold your arms, stick your lips out, pooch them out. I don't care. I'm so unafraid of what anybody in this tent thinks about me right now in my life, I could care less. We just expect that people are going to leave church the same way they came to church. We ought to start having some signs out there that don't have, like handicap accessibility, people in a wheelchair. We ought to start having signs of a wheelchair laying down and somebody just walking up. Well, Pastor, I think you're being insensitive. I think you just don't have any faith is what I think.